world. Okay, so we're recording. We're going to question this in the course. This traditional way of understanding that I have a content in my mind, which we can call, we've heard already, representations. So the world isn't in my mind, right? The world is out there. What's in my mind are representations of the world, right? When I see something, what I see is something in my optical nerve that is being seen in a part of my brain, right? So it's in my brain. It's a representation in my brain, So if you look at it that way, we have a mental content, so content in our mind or brain or mind that corresponds to the way things are in the world. That's the traditional understanding, okay? So mental content or representation makes it present to the mind what's out in the world. The world isn't in my brain. We'll see, that's a problem later. But in common sense, when we think in common sense, the world is out there. It's the framework for my body. My body is in the world, right? My body is in the world. My hand is in the world, right? My hand is in the space of my room in Munich. So my hand, my body, my head, in my brain is in the world, right? But the content of my brain, the content of my mind, the mental present representation is a representation in my mind of what's out in the world, right? So the world is in my mind by means of a representation. All right, so this is a very important point. I'm talking about it a lot, a great deal, because it's so important to understand this traditional picture. I'm calling it a picture, but it's real. But it's also a concept, the traditional concept of what's in my mind represents what's outside my mind. Now, all of contemporary epistemology calls that into question. Okay, so let's look at 2.0. This is a quote from Pritchard's book. I'll come back to Pritchard. He's on the bibliography. I won't spend, I just want to quote one claim that he makes. So 2.0, I say, a more interesting conception would define knowledge as the philosophical defense against skepticism that claim that knowledge is not possible. So certainly modern epistemology is a defense against skepticism. What is skepticism? Skepticism is the philosophical claim, the philosophical position that knowledge is not possible, right? The skeptic says knowledge is not possible. Obviously, your question should be, and my question is, that claim depends upon how we define knowledge. It depends on how we define knowledge, okay? So that's very important. We don't really know what skepticism is negating, what it's denying. So skepticism is a denial of knowledge, but we don't know what that means unless we understand what knowledge means. All right? We don't know that yet. I mean, I gave you traditional view of it, that knowledge is somehow an identity of mental content with the world outside my mind. Okay, so identity of what's in my mind with what's outside my mind. So let me read the quote. This is from Pritchard. I'll come back to this, but this is a very difficult quote, and I'll explain it to you. 2.1. So I'm going to read 2.1, which is a quotation from page 2 of Pritchard's book, Pritchard's article. Epistemological disjunctivism. So disjunctivism is having two things in relation. There's a disjunction, okay? There are two things in relation, A and B. We say mental content in the world. Epistemological disjunctivism is the view that when it comes to paradigm cases of knowledge, so a paradigm case is a model. When we talk about the ideal case, the paradigm case of knowledge, the support available to the subject is both reflectively accessible, that is, in reflection, in the subject's mind, it's accessible to support the claim to knowledge, it's in my mind, and factive. Now, that word factive is really simple, but it sounds complex. Factive means that we don't have to, for knowledge, we don't have to go outside the mind to have knowledge. Knowledge takes place as a fact in the mind. So the claim that knowledge is factive is a very contemporary or modern claim that knowledge is not a relationship between content in my mind in the world, but knowledge is a relationship that is factive, that what I am thinking is the relationship, that I don't have to leave my mind to have knowledge. Knowledge is factive. It's a state of my mind. It's not a relationship between my mind and the world. You see that this claim avoids a lot of problems, but it might not be right. But I'll leave that aside. It might not be right. That somehow knowledge is just a relationship between my thinking and my thought. That's another way of saying this. Knowledge is a relationship of identity between thinking, which is mental, right? Thinking, and the thought that I think. So I'm not leaving my mind. I'm not leaving my mind. I'm not looking out at the world. I'll say, so that's what factive is. This is very close to what Hegel says in the Logic, but that's beside the point. Okay, let me go on with the quote. Then I'll stop for questions in a moment. In particular, so I'm reading, one's reflectively accessible rational basis for knowing, it's reflectively accessible because I'm not leaving my mind. It's in my mind. The reason I have for knowing is in my mind, right? It's not out there. It's in my mind. Accessible rational basis for knowing, that P is the proposition that I believe, right? P is the proposition that I believe. Can be that one sees that P. So I see that P. So I see P, which is in my mind. I see P. So you say, well, I looked out the window before and I saw the weather in Munich, right? I took a walk this morning and I saw the weather. But that scene is in my mind. It's seeing that P. We're seeing that P entails P. So if I see P, it entails P. Entails me, if I see P, then P, right? Last sentence. As far as epistemological orthodoxy goes, such a position is held to be straightforwardly incoherent. Why? Because it's incoherent. That is, it's not coherent because I can be mistaken in what is in my mind. My mind, what I saw as a representation, might not be sufficient reason to believe. What is in my mind as a representation, let's say the weather, might not be sufficient justification. It might not give me a reason to believe that I might have been mistaken. Just to see something in your mind or have an image of it is not sufficient for a claim to know, right? It's not sufficient to base knowledge on simply seeing something and having a representation of the weather in your mind. So this is that the way that traditional epistemology leads to skepticism. If traditional epistemology bases its definition of knowledge based on a relationship in the mind between thinking and a representation in my mind, it might not be sufficient to justify knowledge because I can be mistaken. My seeing something, which is perceiving, might not be sufficient grounds for belief. 2.2, Pritchard argues that this position is perfectly defensible, for it is rooted in our ordinary epistemic practices. It is a coherent, natural position. We'll see the philosopher G.E. Moore, we'll talk more about G.E. Moore later. But Pritchard doesn't agree with the critique, right? The critique, the skeptical critique, that seeing is not sufficient for knowing. He says it's wrong. Pritchard thinks seeing is sufficient reason for knowledge, right? He thinks it is sufficient reason. It's a defensible position. Why is it defensible? 2.2, because it is rooted, it's in our ordinary epistemic practices. It is coherent, it is a coherent, natural position. That is, if I ask you now, tell me what the weather is right now at 2:15, it's exactly 2:15 in Ho Chi Minh City, and you all look out the window, most of you have windows, right? And you tell me what it's like. It seems to be sunny. It seems to be sunny. And you say to me, it's sunny. I have no reason not to believe you, right? I have no reason, because normally, if you look out the window, you see the sun shining, and you report that the sun is shining. That's just common sense. And that should be sufficient reason to accept that as knowledge. It should be sufficient. It's an ordinary, what Pritchard calls in 2.2, ordinary epistemic practice. It's an ordinary epistemic practice. You look up the window, you see the sun, and you report to someone in Germany, it's sunny in Ho Chi Minh City. This happens all the time, right? You simply use your perception, because we assume that perception, which is taking place in the mind, right? Perception is in the mind, is connecting us to the world. We assume that. That's an ordinary assumption, right? It's an ordinary assumption of dogs and cats and animals, that what they see is really in the world. They're not skeptics. Dogs are not skeptics, right? Animals are not skeptics. And so ordinarily, if you look and see something, you're not saying, well, that's only in my mind. You're not saying that. It is in your mind. The representation of sun is in your mind, but there's no reason for you to doubt the ordinary epistemic practice of looking out the window and seeing sun and telling someone in Germany it is sunny at 2:17 in the afternoon in Ho Chi Minh City, right? That's just common sense. And that's the position of Pritchard. So 2.3, Pritchard says, Pritchard has to accept Wittgenstein. I won't spend too much time on Wittgenstein, a little bit later, Wittgenstein's anti-skeptical position that these type of epistemic practices, Wittgenstein calls hinge commitments. Now, I think this word is right in Vietnamese, right? Is that ko noi? Is that ko noi? How do you pronounce it? A hinge is in a door. If you have a door, right, it allows the hinge attaches the door to the wall, right? The hinge here, the hinge allows you to open and close the door. So the hinge is a support. Without the hinge, you couldn't open and close the door, right? It wouldn't be a door without the hinge. But you don't even think when you open a door that there's a hinge. The hinge is there, but you don't think about the hinge. You open the door and it opens. You close the door and it closes because of the hinge. The hinge is vital. But we don't think about the hinge is simply assumed. It's a presupposition of having a door, that you have a hinge. Allows you to open and close the door. And so Wittgenstein's claim is, in knowing, we have a lot of hinges, that is, assumptions about ordinary language and ordinary thinking and perception that allow us to live in the world with knowledge. So these hinges are somehow beyond justification. We assume they're there. We accept the hinge. The hinge means we accept that there are positions where if you open your eyes and you don't have some type of disease in your eye, right? If you open your eyes and you look out the window and you see sunshine, then you can report, I know P, where P is, it is sunny in Ho Chi Minh City. So I know P, right? Not just believe P, I believe it's sunny. But if you looked out the window right now and you see sun, would you say, I believe it's sunny, or would you say, I know it's sunny? What would you say? I think you would say, I know it's sunny, because if you say, I believe it's sunny, that belief is expressing some type of doubt. There's some doubt in your mind. I believe it is, but you know it, don't you? You know it's sunny, because there's no reason not to say, I know it. So it depends, though, on the belief that my eyesight, my vision is good, is accurate, that when I see something out the window, I know it's there, right? I know it's there. And this is a natural position, So perception is a natural hinge for our beliefs, our knowledge claims. So 2.4, rational evaluation is only possible with these hinge commitments in the background. So that's Wittgenstein. W, there is Wittgenstein. These are rational commitments, a hinge commitment. We have a commitment that allows language to take place. The commitment is our perception is reliable. So we'll talk more about these hinge commitments as foundational beliefs later when we talk about reliabilism. The key point, so this is 2.5, the key point, Wittgenstein offers a refutation of the universality of rational evaluation thesis. So Wittgenstein's point is, in other words, 2.6, rationality. So we've said yesterday that human beings, human animals are rational animals, right? Rational animals. And normally in the tradition, Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, Descartes, most philosophers think that this rationality is a universal feature of mind. if you are rational, then you're universally rational. Everyone is rational. And rationality is something shared by having the same thing in your mind. So it's a universal feature of the human animal, that all human animals are rational in the same way. So that we all can do arithmetic. So if I say 2 plus 2 equals 5, then everyone will correct me because you all have the same rational understanding of mathematics and arithmetic. So I can't say 2 plus 2 equals 5 because we all know rationally that 2 plus 2 equals 4. So these are a type of beliefs normally that we think are universal. But for Wittgenstein, he says, rationality is not a universal feature of the mind. It's not the same thing everywhere. It depends on, it's very local, cultural, and conditioned, what we call, using the Latin term here in 2.6, ad hoc. Ad hoc is Latin. It means to this point, to this situation. It's rational in this context, ad hoc. In this culture, it's rational. So Wittgenstein was very aware that you go to a different culture, you see different forms, different types of rational behavior, right? So it's a very relative, local, it depends on the local, on the location of the people. Anyway, we'll come back to this when we get to the skeptical challenge of knowledge. So you probably have some question because some of the Pritchard, especially the quote 2.1 is difficult, but I'll come back to that. That Pritchard thinks that knowledge is not simply factive. It's not that knowledge puts us in contact with something out of the mind, beside the mind, outside the mind. It puts us in contact with something outside the mind, and that's the world, right? And this is what Wittgenstein calls the hinge. We have these hinge beliefs that we can't justify. We just assume they're true because we need them. And they justify why we believe that our vision, our perception of sight, our perception gives us knowledge about the world. That's a hinge. It allows us to live in the world because we assume that visual perception gives us knowledge of the way things are outside of the mind. Of course, perception is in the mind, but it's putting us in contact with the world outside of the mind. Okay, so I'll stop there for a second. Any question, any general question, broad question, I'll come back to all this information. All of these points we'll come back to later on next week. Any immediate question now?
I have one question about reliable. You said about the perception of our sensibility, but when I read Carn in his book, Critique on the Pure Reason, he said that two sources of perception is sensible and understanding. So how should we know for sure that when like I look at the weather outside my window, how should I know? Because the sensibility is I think it's not reliable because it's just you can see only what your ability to see. You cannot see the truth after that. I see on the weather is cloudy, but maybe 30 minutes later it's sunny. So how could I be so sure? Then I said, I know the weather is cloudy, rather than I believe, because that is based on my sensibility, not my
Yeah,
knowledge. Yeah,
yeah,
my
right,
understanding.
right. Well, we have to think a lot about Kant, the points Kant makes in the Critique of Pure Reason. But let me not talk about that. Just answer your question. I think you have to be sensitive when we're making these claims about perception, about the context. So when Wittgenstein says these hinges, these presuppositions that my perception of sight is reliable, we have to make it very, very define the context. And so I think one could say, I know it is sunny. That's why I gave the time. I was very careful to give the time. Remember when I said, you're looking out the window at 2:15 or 2:17. I gave the time in the place and it's sunny. So I assumed when I said that, I was trying to convey that you have to contextualize, give a context. So give a context, and that means a time and a place. So we're not talking about all of Ho Chi Minh City or all of Vietnam. Who knows? In the north today is probably rainy. There could be a typhoon. We know the weather is very changeable, especially by the ocean. So we're just saying, in where we are at St. Joseph's, this part of Ho Chi Minh City at 2:17 is sunny when I look out the window. So that really limits it. And I think Wittgenstein would say it's very local, it's conditioned, but I think we would say, well, that's knowledge. So you're not making a claim for 10 minutes from now. Now it's 2:30. It might be different right now. It might be very different. So it's very, very limited. It's very limited. So that's how I think Wittgenstein would answer that.
Okay, thanks.
Is that okay?
Yeah, I understand. It's just about the Latin word ad hoc, right?
Yeah. Well, ad hoc literally means ad is to, and hoc is this place. So it's in respect to this place. It's all ad hoc. Any foundational belief is not universal. It depends on an ad hoc, a culture, a place, a time, a location. So it's very relative. So Wittgenstein was really against Kant. He was not a Kantian. Wittgenstein was very, very interested in language and the way language works. So he thinks that the rationality of language was very contingent, was very local and cultural and conditioned, ad hoc. That's what ad hoc means. So it's not a universal, because we can be misled by arithmetic. And that's what Wittgenstein thinks happens. We can be misled by logic and arithmetic and geometry and say, well, look at 2 + 2 is 4. Everyone knows that, therefore rationality is universal. But Wittgenstein said, well, no, some kinds of rational actions or thinking are universal, say arithmetic or logic, but not everything we think and say and know is universally true. So it's very, very conditioned. But that I'll come back and talk more about Wittgenstein later, and Kant as well. I'll give a lecture on Kant later. Okay, so let's unless someone has another question, let's move just to say a few more things about. We've already talked about this, but one point that Zagzebski makes in her article, and if I'll clarify that there are 2 articles that are available on Zagzebski, What is Knowledge, but I'll clarify this next week when I get to the library at St. Joseph's. So as I said, I'm arriving tomorrow evening. I'll look at the 2 articles. But anyways, in what is knowledge, she says, number one, knowledge is valuable because it puts us in contact with reality. So that's a basic assumption. And one of the ways that knowledge puts us in contact with reality is perception. And perception is sensible perception of our bodies in the world. So to have a body is a function of the mind. The mind depends on a body, and the body allows us to perceive the world. Now, of course, Kant would say that's right, but it doesn't allow us to perceive the world as it is, but it puts us in contact with the world. Even Kant would say that. So that's why knowledge is valuable. It puts us in contact with reality. But that's very ambiguous. It's not clear what in contact means. That's very, 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 very unclear. Look here. What does in contact mean? That's very vague. I wouldn't be, as a philosopher, I'm not really happy with that as a concept because it's too vague. It's too unclear. What does in contact mean? Does it mean touch? Does it mean I have to touch it? No. But it's a sense, the sensible perception of the world puts us in contact with reality, and even reality is not right. So that's why I put i.e., that is the world. But what is the world? That's unclear. So I'm doing a self-critique. Someone asked me a question in an email about language. If you look at number one, I'm giving a critique of my own language here, the concepts here, because all the concepts, so in reality, and then in contact, and then the world, these are all vague. They're not clear. They're not really clear and precise. What am I supposed to be thinking when I think contact? Does it mean physical contact or what? And what does reality mean? So I wrote there, that means the world. But what does the world mean? What is the world? Are we talking about the earth? Are we talking about the sun? Are we talking about the universe? What is the world? So all of that is very, very vague. And we have to be aware and self-critical when we're thinking and talking that a lot of our words, even though they have an ordinary meaning, I mean, if you use the word contact, I understand what you mean by contact, right? Or you talk about reality, something's real or made up, I understand in ordinary language. Or you talk about the world, I understand, but we're using these as concepts in a philosophical argument, and they're not really clear. They're not really clear. So one has to be self-critical in the use of language, always, in philosophy. So number two, it is a relation between a conscious subject. So we have to be careful about conscious subject. I want to say awake. So the knower, let's assume the subject, the knower is awake. Because you can be dreaming. Are you conscious when you're dreaming? Well, yeah, you have awareness. You have awareness of the dream, right? That allows you to be aware and to know what you dream, what you're dreaming. When you wake up, you know. Sometimes you know, sometimes you forget what the dream was. So there's a consciousness, awareness of dreaming, but you're not awake, you're dreaming. So we're talking about here being awake. The knower is awake, and the object to which he is either directly or indirectly related. So let me clarify what she means, and this is very important, but I'll come back to this next week as well. How the knower is related to the object. The object is simply what you know, right? The object known, the object that is known in the proposition. So the proposition is, it is sunny in Ho Chi Minh City at 2:37, right? So that's P. So there's always P. And P is a representation of the way things are in the world. But now she says, and this is she's taking from Bertrand Russell, you can be related directly or indirectly. So let me explain quickly A and B, direct knowledge. So what is direct? So we have direct knowledge and indirect knowledge. What's direct knowledge? So this goes back due to an essay by Bertrand Russell that he wrote in 1912, a very important essay. So here's what direct knowledge is. Direct knowledge, I'll read it, A, places us in immediate contact. So now I'm adding immediate to contact. So it's contact that is immediate. There's nothing comes between us and the object, right? It's immediate. Think of, and I give the example, think of holding a baby or seeing a sunset. So direct knowledge would be the knowledge you have only by holding a baby, or the knowledge you have of a sunset only by seeing a sunset. So one can describe a sunset, right? Or the mother of the baby can describe what it's like holding a baby, but you don't know that directly. You know that indirectly. Direct knowledge of holding a baby is not a proposition in words. Direct knowledge is simply holding the baby or seeing a sunset. As direct knowledge only comes about if you're seeing a sunset. You can read a poem, you can see a picture, you can hear a description of a sunset or a mother holding a baby. But that's all secondary. It's indirect. Direct knowledge is actually having the perception, and it's not mediated. It's not conveyed by language or a concept. Now, holding a baby, you just know by holding a baby. Seeing a sunset, you know by just seeing a sunset. And this is called, and Russell calls this knowledge by acquaintance. So direct knowledge is knowledge by acquaintance, derived from Russell's all our knowledge rests upon acquaintance for its foundation. So the foundation of all knowledge, according to Bertrand Russell, is acquaintance, is this immediate contact with reality that is not conceptual, it's not a description, it's not language, it's not words, it's the perception, it's the immediate experience. Acquaintance provides us with immediate sense data of which we are conscious as a mental presentation. But we do not necessarily know that this data is real, that is, whether it exists outside my mind. See Descartes' dream experience. So there's still some, even in direct knowledge, there's some room for doubting if it is really, I have to be careful, whether there really is, we're not making the claim that there really is a baby in my arms or hands, or that there really is a sunset. But I'm getting direct knowledge of that by holding the baby or seeing the sunset. I mean, it could be, this is some of the problems with perception. It could be an illusion. It could be a dream. So we don't know that. We might have to think about that. But acquaintance by knowledge by acquaintance is direct experience, perception of something. Yeah. And of course, we have in the background Descartes' dream experience, where you have the experience of something, the perception of knowledge by acquaintance, but it's not really actually happening outside the dream. And then B, indirect knowledge, which Russell calls knowledge by description, but I prefer to call it propositional knowledge because it is expressed in language by means of concepts, because it is an inference that X is real or exists because the concept of X fits or corresponds to the immediate sense data. So indirect knowledge or knowledge by description is propositional knowledge because it's always expressed in language, right, by means of concepts, right? So the mother can describe to you in words, in concepts, what it's like to hold the baby, or a poet, can write a poem about seeing the sunset over the sea, over the ocean, and you have some indirect knowledge by description of what it's like because of the description, because the proposition is expressed in language, in words, and in concepts that you understand, right? Okay, then 3, A provides experiential contact. So that's direct knowledge by acquaintance provides experiential contact. You have the direct, immediate experience of something. And B, description, knowledge by description, provides a true proposition about the world in language and concepts, right? That gives you also indirect knowledge of the world. 4, so knowing John is an example of acquaintance knowledge. Knowing John, I know John, I know who John is. I know when I see him, it is John. Knowing that John is a philosopher is an example of propositional knowledge. So you can pick out John because you have a perception of his face, right? You've seen his face, you know his face, you know the structure of his nose and his eyes and his mouth. That's direct acquaintance, direct knowledge from acquaintance. But then you can have propositional knowledge of John if you know that John is a philosopher, so that you're knowing something about him, right? You're knowing something about him, and that's knowledge which is propositional, indirect knowledge about him. You don't know that he's a philosopher by acquaintance with his face, by what he looks like. 5, knowledge is communicated by means of language and propositions, therefore it assumes a great importance in philosophical analysis of knowing truth and social conditions of knowledge. Zagzebski writes, this is page 11, the object of knowledge is more easily explained when it is a proposition. So when the object of knowledge is simply there directly, we don't have anything to think. All we have is you either have the direct experience, right? Or you don't have it. If you don't have it, then you're left without in the dark. But when the object of knowledge is explained by a proposition, then you have a way to know and understand it indirectly by means of language and concepts. So a proposition is linguistic, and it uses concepts to convey what the experience is like. What is it like to hold a baby? What is it like to look at a sunset? Okay, I think we're out of time. Yeah, I think let's take a break here, and then I'll have to see if I want to finish this now or go to Aristotle. I might just finish this. Let's take a 10-minute break. So it's 2:47. We'll come back at, we'll come back at about 2:58 or so. Okay, thank you. welcome back. Thank you. Sorry, I'm a little bit late. I'm in the process of packing for the flight this evening. I leave this evening, Munich. So I'm packing right now. So let's go back and finish these points, and then we'll begin the PowerPoint slide on Aristotle and epistemic justice or epistemic injustice about women and children and slaves as not being capable of thinking, doing philosophy. So let me see where I am. Let's go to number 6. Explain number 6 and finish this slide. Propositions, she writes, are either true or false, and link the knower with reality in a satisfying relation. Knowledge is taken to be a true proposition. So that, I think, most people will agree with. Knowledge is a true proposition. So proposition is a sentence. It's a phrase, a sentence in Vietnamese, in English, in French, in German, that is true, okay? So that's a traditional understanding of knowledge. And a proposition, any linguistic statement, as any sentence in a language, can be judged either true or false, right? Any sentence in a language has two truth values: the truth value T or the truth value F. So we say, we'll talk about truth values. Truth values equals T or F. So any sentence has truth values, and the truth values are T or F, true or false, for any claim you make, for any proposition. So any proposition which is expressed in language is T or F. Hence, philosophers usually pay greater attention to the state of knowledge by which the subject is related to a true proposition, because we can evaluate it. How do we evaluate knowledge by acquaintance? There's really nothing to evaluate, because the woman holding the baby, it just has this acquaintance of what it's like to hold the baby. When she puts it into language, then we can think about it and evaluate it. But if it's just that direct, immediate experience of holding the baby or seeing the sunset, then that's very, very particular. It's very personal. Whereas a proposition, indirect knowledge, indirect knowledge by description, is much more social and universal and open to judgment. It's open to evaluation, to be a claim made to be either T or F, right? We can't evaluate knowledge by acquaintance because there's nothing to evaluate. You know, the woman holding the baby is not saying anything. When she expresses it in words and language and says something in a proposition, then we can evaluate, right? Or but when it's just that immediate direct acquaintance, then that's just the contact with reality, the contact of the baby's reality that only the mother knows, or the father when he's holding the baby. We can't discriminate against the father of the baby, So 7, Zizetsky says on page 12, she defines belief with St. Augustine as a state of the subject in which, quote, to believe is to think with assent. So Zizetsky believes in that knowledge is not factive, that knowledge is based on belief, and what unites us to the world is having beliefs about the world. So the contact we have with the world generates beliefs in us, which are then expressed in propositions, which we claim to know, that give us knowledge. So Zabzetsky believes in the traditional picture or concept that knowledge begins with belief, a state of believing, which then becomes a state of knowing, but knowledge builds on belief. You can't know something unless you believe it. That would be the traditional way. So she says, with Augustine, to believe is to think with assent, because belief is already thinking, right? When you believe something, you're thinking about something, and you think with assent. Assent here means you think it's true, you accept it, right? Assent is you're thinking, when I believe something, I think, well, this is so, this is true. I think it's true. I believe it's so, right? Therefore, if I state, I'm reading number 7, therefore, if I state, I believe in God, or I believe you, I assent to the propositions that God exists and that you are an honest person. So I assent to what I think. I agree with it. I accept it. I think that God exists. I believe God exists. I believe you are an honest person, even though there is room for doubt. So when you say you believe it, you accept it. You accept it's true, but you don't yet know it's true, right? There's room, as I say here, there's room for doubt. So that's a good phrase in English when you say there's room for doubt, that I believe it, I think it's true, I believe that God exists, that I believe that God exists, I think God exists, I believe you're an honest person, I think you're an honest person, but there's room for doubt. There's room for doubt. That doesn't mean I'm a skeptic. That doesn't mean I'm a skeptic. A skeptic doesn't believe God exists. He doubts that we can know God exists, okay? Even though there is room for doubt, I still believe P. I believe P. There's room for doubt, but I still believe P, that God exists and that you are an honest person. But I don't know it. I don't know. So the key word here is know. I don't know. Of course, this depends on how we define the concept of knowledge. We've only started to define knowledge, right? That knowledge is just a belief about the world that is true, a true belief about the world. But there's more to be said about that. There's more to be said about that. What do we mean when we say it's a true belief? How do we know that? You have to know it's true. What does it mean to know that? Okay. So number 8, taking something as true is standardly called the state of belief. So the state of belief, when you believe, you're in a state, your mind is in a state of belief about something. And what that means is you take something as true. So I believe in God. I believe you are honest. It means my mind is in a state of belief that God exists. Or my mind is in a state of belief that you are honest, a good person. I cannot believe P is the proposition, God exists or you are honest, unless I take P to be true. If I don't think P is true, I can't believe it. So belief carries with it the assent to truth, the acceptance of the truth. But But number 8, but I allow that I might be mistaken. This possibility, as I say, there's room for doubt. There's room for doubt. Maybe not too much room, but there's room for doubt, right? There's room for doubt. But do we want to conclude that if we take something to be true, we believe it, we take it to be true, we believe it, and it is true, then we know it. So do we want to conclude then? 9, do we want to conclude that if we take something to be true, if we believe something, that means we take it to be true, and it is true, whatever that means, right? Taking something to be true doesn't make it true, okay? Believing something doesn't make it true. This is the problem with the internet, right? With Google. Taking something to be true doesn't make it true. All right? That's very important. But what is true? So I capitalize T-R-U-E. What then is truth? What does it mean it's true? Then we know it. To take something as true does not make it true. That is, we can't know it unless it's true. So belief doesn't make it true. Belief simply means we have some evidence, some reason to believe it, to take it as true. We could be wrong. So knowledge is true belief? That's my question. Is knowledge true belief? I don't know. True belief knowledge might be lacking something else than true belief. If you have true belief, then you have knowledge. That's a question. That's a question. I think it's a very important question at this point. This is our second class. So this is the second day. This is our important question. Does true belief make something knowledge? If you have a belief and the belief is true, does that mean you have knowledge? You have a belief, right? And you believe is true, and the belief is true, right? Does that mean you have knowledge of it? I'll continue reading in 9 in brackets. But this doesn't follow. It doesn't follow. If knowing is a factive state of the mind, knowledge has something to do with me, with my mind, in my thinking, not with the object of belief, not with the object of belief. So we're not talking about the object of belief will make it true, will give me knowledge. Now, if it's factive, then it's internal to the mind. Factive equals knowledge is in my mind and not a relationship between, let's say, God, my mind and God, or your being an honest person. So if knowledge is factive, then knowledge is a relation in my mind between what I think and what is thought, not between what I think and God, or what I think and you being an honest person. If it's really factive, if it's a state of my mind, then it's all in my mind. Zavzetsky says on page 13, she disagrees. She thinks knowledge is a form of belief, and we'll come back to this. So she doesn't believe that knowledge is factive, that knowledge is a relation between thinking and thought. She thinks it's a relationship that's between believing and the object of belief. And the object of belief is what we're thinking about, that is God, or you are an honest person. So Zavzetsky has a very traditional, in a sense, a traditional view of knowledge that isn't factive. Factive is, it's just a state of my mind. It's my thinking in what I think, right? That's knowledge. Knowledge is that relation internal to my mind, but she thinks it's a relation between what I think, what I believe, and the object of my belief, which is outside the mind. So God is outside my mind. If you are an honest person, that's you exist outside my mind, not in my mind. We'll come back, as I keep on saying, we'll come back to this. It's an interesting thought to defend the state of mind, that knowledge is simply factive. But I'm not going to say more about that now. Number 10, and then I'll conclude with this. She goes on then to give a moral interpretation, a moral evaluation of knowledge, which I think is very, very important, to look upon knowledge as a moral state of the person, a moral state. So she writes, knowledge is praiseworthy. To know something is to be considered praiseworthy. Lack of knowledge is a great pity. So having knowledge to know something is praiseworthy. It's good for you. It's something good and praiseworthy. But lack of knowledge is a great pity. But we don't always blame a person for lack of knowledge. There are lots of things we don't know, but we don't feel blame all the time. Sometimes we do feel blame if we should have known something. But if I don't know God exists, or if I don't know you're an honest person, if I don't know it, then I'm not to blame for that. Maybe you haven't shown me that you're an honest person, right? If I don't know God exists, maybe I'm not to blame for that. Maybe it's not my fault. Maybe I don't have enough evidence, enough reason to believe that. I think that's very, very important. In the world today, as Pope Francis was talking about it yesterday in Lisbon, in Portugal, many, many people, more and more in Catholic countries, don't believe in God. And we say, well, that's a great pity. That's really a shame. But we shouldn't condemn them. Is it their fault? Are they to blame for not believing, not knowing that God exists? These are very, very difficult questions, especially when you put it on a cultural level. You look at a whole culture that is changing, which the Pope tried to do yesterday in his homily in one of the monasteries in Lisbon. This leads Zagzebski, so reading number 10, to introduce knowing as a practical virtue. So knowing is a virtue in the sense of Aristotle, namely an excellence of the soul or the mind that completes the human being, that makes the human being more complete as a human being. So if you're a human being and you lack knowledge, then you're lacking something as a human being. Knowledge is an excellence of your soul. Zagzebski references Plato. This is page 14, number 7, or footnote number 7. She writes, Plato calls knowledge the most important element in life. This is in the Protagoras dialogue of Plato, and says that the only thing truly evil is to be deprived of knowledge. The only thing evil, truly evil, is to be deprived of knowledge, according to Plato. Okay, there's more to be thinking here. To think of knowledge as a virtue of the mind, I think is really, really important. And it's really something that Zagzebski has contributed to our thinking about knowledge. Why is it a virtue of the mind to have knowledge? Okay, so I'm going to just stop for a second to give you a chance to raise questions. There are a lot of things in here. Don't be too concerned about the factive relation between the mind and the object known. But the traditional system, the traditional theory that Zagzebski holds that she accepts is knowledge is the relationship between believing in the mind and an object that is believed outside the mind. And if the object that is believed outside the mind is true, then we're moving towards knowledge. We're moving towards a definition of knowledge. But it's a relationship between belief and knowing, belief and knowing. Okay, so I'm going to, if anyone has a question, I'm going to change the PowerPoint. You can think about a question or think about the PowerPoint. Let me close this. Okay, so let me make this a little bit bigger. Can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Let me,
Yes, I'm seeing it.
okay, thank you. Let me make this, how's that? Is that better?
Yes, clear.
It's a little bit bigger for you. Okay, so this is this whole PowerPoint has to do with epistemic injustice. So the preface, it's really a preface. We're not yet doing real epistemology. This is really an introduction. It's a note on Aristotle and the topic of social epistemology in the epistemic injustice. So we'll think more about this, obviously, as we get further on in the course, in the last week of the course, social aspect of epistemology. Testimony is very important here, but this is just going to focus a little bit on epistemic injustice. That's the name of a book by a professor at the University of London. So let me go on. Let me close this. Okay, so terms for mind. So here are some words we need to think about. I've used already just to give you some sense of them. So we use psyche, is the Greek for mind or spirit, but also can mean reason, desire, instinct, principle of life. So psyche has a lot of senses. Mind or spirit is a good translation in English, but it gets translated into Latin. Psyche is Greek, and in Latin it's anima, which is usually translated as soul. So that becomes soul. So what's happening in many ways is that the Greek understanding of the human being, when it's translated into Latin, especially in the Middle Ages, becomes much more theological in a way that it wasn't theological for the Greeks. So when they say psyche, we can even think of psychology, because our word in English for psychology, which is the study of the mind or of the psyche, comes from psyche, whereas anima in Latin gives us more an understanding of something religious or theological, etc., relationship between the person and God. But it doesn't have that sense in Greek. And also in German, the word Geist in German, which is very important in German philosophy, really has more the sense of Psyche and not the sense of anima. So Geist in German really is more like mind or spirit or reason, desire, principle of life, etc. And so this is Hegel's attempt to bring the human being as Geist in relationship to something bigger than the spirit or mind. It's something transcendent, which connects the mind or the person to thinking or logic, etc. So do we think so the question we have is, do we think by means of words or concepts? So I've already called your attention to this tension between words and concepts here. That words usually have an ordinary sense that are evident and we all understand. If you understand the language, then we understand the words. If you have a good understanding of English, then you'll understand the words I am using. Or I don't understand the words in Vietnamese because I don't understand Vietnamese. But that doesn't mean if you understand my words that you understand the concepts. And as I said, words are usually clear and we can define them in the dictionary or even on Google, but concepts are not. Concepts can be very, very vague, and especially philosophical concepts. We've already seen an instance of that. So what I want to say here, what do you see? So let's look at, I want to talk about perception here as an introduction to Aristotle, who thought a lot about perception. So perception 1, so what do you see? And I think we all see quite easily, we're looking at a circle, right? That's a circle. And we agreed to that as a circle. And that is both a word and a concept, So we can pick it out, point to it something as a circle that isn't really a circle. There are very few circles, because circle as a concept is a mathematical or geometric construction, and it has very precise criteria for drawing a circle. There is, so to draw a circle properly, it has to be, as you can see, defined geometrically by the perimeter in the shape of it, in the distance between 2 points on the circle, etc. When I draw a circle, it's not technically a circle, but that on the screen is a concept of a circle. It's a circle, and it's the concept of a circle if you defined it. Okay, but we know we can name that. We see and we name it a circle. Both the word and the concept are identical here, the word and the concept. And here, perception 2, I see and I can think a square. And again, there are precise determinations, rules for what a square is in terms of the angles and the lines, etc., and the square roots, etc., of a square. But we're all agreed that that is a square. And we see this, I think we know the word in English is triangle. And we not only know it's a triangle, but we can think it as and define it in the terms of the concept triangle, which has a precise geometric definition three-sided, etc., the different relationship between the angles, different types of triangle, depending on how the angles are opened, etc., and relate to one another. And we have the Pythagorean theorem. There are ways that we can do demonstrations of certain properties of different triangles. All that goes back is the concept of a triangle. But we use the word, and then we can think the concept without much difficulty here. So we go from image to word to concept, because we've studied it. We can use it in a sentence. We can think about it in geometry. We know what's going on here. But when we go to here, and I ask you, what do you see? There is a problem here. What do you see? Name this shape. So we named circle, square, triangle. But what is this shape here? What is this shape? I have no concept for this shape. And I have no word for this shape, right? I mean, I made this up. I did a squiggle using the drawing app, right? I just squiggled something. I could have done anything. And it means nothing, right? Some people might think they see something, some object there, some image there, but there's really nothing there. There was nothing in my mind. I didn't intend anything. I was just squiggling something, something that might have been just absurd. You might see something there, but there's nothing intended there. So you can invent a word for it. You can call it anything you want. So we can invent a word. I say squiggle, just doesn't really mean anything. It just means a bunch of lines that are random. But there's no concept there. So you can invent a word, but I don't know what could a concept possibly be there, right? There's no concept that I can possibly think about there. If you ask me to repeat that, give me a blank piece of paper and ask me to repeat it, I couldn't possibly repeat it because I don't know what it is. I don't have it in my memory. No, it was random. We call it random. Okay, so this says something. It's a question here when we go back and look at these shapes. We go from an image to a word in a language to a concept in geometry that we can all understand and think and use in many, many different ways, for building, for architecture, for understanding the universe and the world in many ways. But this doesn't do anything. Even though we can make up a word for it, we can't think of it as a concept. There's something it doesn't fit. So my question is, what does it mean to fit? Why do these things fit? This and this and this. And we could draw lines and do other different things and angles and parallelisms and all different types of shapes and geometry that fit our mind, but this doesn't fit. So do words and concepts fit? Do they fit the world, or they fit our science, our knowledge? They fit our geometry, etc. So it's just a question I'm posing here of how do we get our concepts from? And that's obviously important in epistemology. Where do concepts come from? And they say concepts are more vital to our thinking than simply words that pick out and identify something. What is a concept? Concept must express some type of essence, some type of property that I can think about and understand. But this doesn't give me anything to think about or to understand. Now, how can thoughts match the world? The relation between thinking and the world that produces knowledge from our activity of knowing. So in a way, we can say here, this doesn't match the world, right? It doesn't match the world. But this does, although there are no perfect triangles in the world, right? There are no perfect squares or circles in the world. There were people looking at images and photographs of Mars, the planet Mars, and some people wanted to prove that these images of Mars proved or indicated that there was intelligent life had been on Mars, because they thought they saw on Mars some type of triangle, and that you never find a triangle or a square in nature. Nature doesn't produce perfect squares. Nature doesn't produce triangles. And that was thought of that it wasn't a random shape in the stones, but there were stones that looked like they were constructed to be a triangle or constructed to be a square. And that was proof that there was intelligent life at some point on Mars. It's just a coincidence. I mean, things look on a photo, on an image, they look like squares and triangles, but they're not really squares and triangles. It's just the image or of what's digitally reconstructed from how the stones are arranged. It's just an accident. It's just a contingency. So how can thoughts match the world? The relationship between thinking and the world that produces knowledge from our activity of knowing. So where does knowledge come from in the world? If there are not perfect shapes, if they're not perfect squares or triangles in the world, if there are there principles, are there scientific laws in the world, or are there scientific laws in our mind? So all these are very important questions in epistemology. Do we make up the figures and the laws of science, of physics, the way we make up circles and squares and triangles? But we find this in nature, but we want to make it something ordered and clear and scientific and logical, etc. But it's really perhaps just chaos. Perhaps it's chaos. It only appears to us this way. How is it possible that the world corresponds to our thoughts about it? The tension between epistemology and metaphysics. So epistemology says that the world is intelligible to us, that the world can be known, the world can be thought. But is this actually the way the world is? Is that ontology is what is the being of these things? What is the being of the world? Or is science and epistemology just the way we construct the world? We have to construct the world in ways that we can think it. So these are very difficult questions that force a kind of conclusion upon us. So one conclusion would be Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason, who tried to understand these things, but how the world corresponds to our thinking. How does the world, the physical world outside the mind, correspond to our thinking? If the world doesn't really have circles, doesn't really have squares or triangles, but it's more like that. If the world is somehow chaotic, I mean, we impose order onto the world. Are our mathematical scientific equations, so I talked about equations yesterday. So x is equal to y is an equation. It's a mathematical and scientific equation. X is equal to y. And so we don't know what x is, but if you know what y is, y gives us information to understand x, right? X is unknown, or we want to know what x is. So the equation x is equal to y. If x is equal to y, then if we know y, then we have good information about what x is. So scientific equations are manifestations of objective laws of nature. Plato thought that, or our attempt to describe our experience of nature in mathematical terms, equations, that we invent like a language. So language doesn't exist in nature. Language exists in our mind. We invent terms and words in our language to represent the world. But our mathematical equations also manifestations of a structure of nature, or are they simply constructions in our mind? Now, what is in physics, in Einstein's equation, as an example of an equation, what is an equation? An equation is a statement in which the values of two mathematical expressions are equal. So x is equal to y, and they give information. Y gives more information about x. X is explained by what follows. So we have in Einstein's equation, one of his equations, E is equal to mc squared. That's an equation. What is E? E is energy. We want to know what energy is. What is energy? Energy is mc squared. So m is mass, the mass times speed of light squared. So c is the speed of light squared. That's what energy is. Energy is mass times speed of light squared, gives us an insight into what energy is. We want to know what is energy. And Einstein discovered this math, he invented really this mathematical equation that gives us insight into what energy is. Energy seems to be something that we can never grasp, right? It just is. It's just energy is there. But he saw that there was a way to analyze physics and movement in space and time to give us an insight into what energy is. Physics thinks through equations and argues. Physics thinks and argues through equations. Contemporary science and all modern science since Descartes and Newton states its discoveries in terms of mathematical equations. In my example of shapes, perfect circles, squares, and triangles are not found in nature, but are constructions of the mind. But why are we puzzled by my last shape, what I'm calling a squiggle? Squiggle is just anything that doesn't have a name, just a movement of the pen on the paper. Okay, so now we move to Aristotle and testimony. Aristotle considers his own views on slaves and women as knowledge, as true beliefs. So Aristotle thought that his views on slaves and women and children, but we want to focus on, he's probably right about children at some point, but we focus on slaves and women as knowledge. He thought his views were right. They were true beliefs, therefore elements of aspects of knowledge. And Aristotle was a great philosopher. So he thought his views were true beliefs, therefore knowledge, and he was a great philosopher. His views on metaphysics and ethics influenced Western culture for 1,500 years, especially Catholic thought. So Aristotle was the philosopher for the Middle Ages, for Catholic thought. St. Thomas Aquinas, when he would write or quote Aristotle's text. He simply referred to Aristotle as the philosopher, the philosopher. So for Thomas Aquinas, Aristotle was the philosopher. He was the last word, the definitive word in terms of philosophical reasoning, right? If you looked for theological reasoning, then Thomas would look towards St. Augustine. But if you're looking for a philosophical reasoning, then St. Thomas Aquinas would look towards Aristotle as the philosopher. Okay, let's now look at what he said and the influence of Aristotle on our thought, not only on Catholic thought, but on philosophical and ethical thought and the way we think about the world, which comes from Aristotle. Aristotle invented certain sciences, and Aristotle invented logic. Aristotle invented biology. These are things that didn't exist before Aristotle put them in systematic form. So what Aristotle said and wrote was definitive for 1,500 years almost in the West, in Western thinking, especially in Catholic thinking. So let's look at these texts that, as I said yesterday, I don't expect you to read any of this from the text of Aristotle's Politics. I've quoted the key text here. So let's begin with the Politics. These are all of these books of Aristotle that we have are notes that he used to lecture. So these are lecture notes that he would be giving a class, a course on politics, and he would keep these and then sort of publish them, or others, his followers, would publish them as books, the metaphysics, the ethics, and the politics, etc. So here's what he has to say about slaves. So a quote, I'll read the whole thing and then we can think about it. And also that in some instances, such a distinction does exist. He's talking about the distinction of slave and non-slave. When slavery for the one and mastership for the other are advantageous and just. So Aristotle looking at, in the Politics, in social life, how is it that we have some who are masters and some who are slaves? Where does this come from? That's what he's looking at. How is it possible that if we're dealing with rational animals, right, human beings, and slaves are rational animals, they're human beings, and the masters are rational animals, they're human beings. How is it that we have this distinction between masters and slaves if we're all rational animals? So that's the question for Aristotle, and he wants to solve it. He's thinking, well, this is a problem. How can we explain and justify that some people are slaves, some people are masters, if we're all human beings? You see the problem. And so he says, well, the reason is that you have this distinction between slaves and masters, that it is advantageous and just. So these are two different terms here. To be advantageous is to benefit society. It's a benefit that there are masters, and it's a benefit that there are slaves. But he also says it's obviously a benefit to the master that he has a slave. It's not so clear that's a benefit to the slave. But anyways, he said, well, it's a benefit and advantageous. It means it's a benefit. It's beneficial to have a society based on masters and slaves. But he also says it's just. So just, advantageous is a kind of instrumental term. It's a concept that means people can take advantage, can have benefit in this. And undoubtedly, that's true. If you're a master, you find advantage in having slaves. But he also uses an ethical term here, justice, decay. Decay is just that, that there are slaves and there are masters. And it is proper for the one party to be governed and for the other to govern by the form of government by which they are by nature fitted. So now he introduces a third term. You have advantage and ethically right, ethically just. But it is proper to have governed, people who are governed, people who govern by the form of government for which they are by nature fitted, by nature. So the key term here is by nature fitted. So he wants to say that the final justification for this, for the advantage and for the justice of this arrangement, the social arrangement, has something to do with nature. That's the claim here, and that's a real problem. And so you can see his thinking, right? He has a contradiction here, that there are slaves and that there are masters. He knows it's beneficial, but how can it be just? How can it be ethically just by nature? He said, well, it's by nature. This isn't something we do. It isn't something we invented. It is by nature. And go on to say, and therefore by the exercise of mastership, while to govern badly is to govern disadvantageously for both parties, for the same thing is advantageous for a part and for the whole body or the whole soul, and the slave is a part of the master. He is, as it were, a part of the body, alive, but yet separated from it. So the argument he makes here is not at all reasonable. He's saying by nature, the slave is really a part of the body and the soul of the master, that the slave lacks independence, that the slave is already part of the whole soul of the master and the body of the master, and therefore he can share in the advantage of the slave, of being a slave, because he shares in the body, in the soul of the master. The slave is part of the master. He is, as it were, a part of the body, and yet alive, but yet separated from it. This is very, very strange, very, very strange reasoning. He's both a part of the body, alive, yet separated from the body of the master. It's very, very obscure, the reasoning when he's saying that really the body of the slave finds its completion, its wholeness in the whole body, in the whole soul of the master. So the master has the whole body, the master has the whole soul. This is suke, right? This is the suke here. In the slave shares in this. So therefore, what the master does and what the master commands is indirectly beneficial to the slave. Aristotle makes, I have to move this. Excuse me for a moment. I have to go back to this. Oops. I had to stop because I lost track of the time. So let's take a break here, and we'll come back in 10 minutes that will be, what time? At 4, right? At 4:05, we'll come back. So let's take a 10-minute break now, and I'll see you at 4:05. Thank you.
Sorry, Professor. I
Yes.
have a small question. It's not relevant to the epistemology, but relevant to the politic of Aristotle.
Yes.
So he said that man by nature is a politic animal. Can you explain a little bit about that for me, because I'm not clear about those.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. That really involves the entire defense of Aristotle's position. Aristotle is basing his position not in philosophy, not in ethics, not in metaphysics. He's basing the division between masters and slaves, and masters and males and women, on nature, not on philosophy, and not on ethics. So that's what he's doing. He's saying, look, this isn't my philosophy. This is based on biology. This is nature, physis. So nature in Greek is physis. Nature is physics, right? Nature is physics. Nature is biology. And so he's saying there are masters and slaves by biology. That is, biologically, and therefore psychologically, slaves are slaves because they are part of the master's body and the master's mind. Now, not literally part of the master's body, because they're not attached to the body, but they depend upon the master's body for power. The power they have, because they're slaves, comes from the master's body. And the rationality that they have comes from the master's mind. So the master, by nature, has the mind, has the reason, has the rationality, and has the power to give the slaves, right, a whole life, as much of a whole life as they can have, by sharing in the life and the power and the reason of the master. But it's not their power and it's not their reason. And he's somehow saying it's lacking because of their nature, biologically lacking. But we look at that, I look at that and say, what does that have to do with nature? It's a political and sociological division, right? Has nothing to do with nature. What does this have to do with biology? What does this have to do with the mind? As if slaves could not think, slaves could not reason, as though slaves lacked their own power, principle of power in their bodies, which is absurd. Of course they have power within their bodies, and of course they can think. So that's the problem. His justification is really, really horrible. It's just made up, is really constructed to be by nature. So the key term is by nature. And you always find people, even today, who will justify slavery and domination of one group over the other group by means of nature. You still hear that. And of course, there's no objective reasoning there. So this is, I'll continue after the break, but the problem is how to understand by nature. And it's not defensible. This is really where Aristotle really goes wrong, and you wonder why he could go so wrong when when his teacher, that is Plato, denied this, never made an argument based on nature. Now, Plato made an argument simply based on rationality. He said that we're all rational, that masters and slaves and women, we're all rational, therefore we should all share in the capacity to think philosophically. This is Plato in the Republic. So it's very, very strange that he's constructing this argument based on nature. But it's strange, but yet you still hear this. You can go to anyone who is a racist or a sexist, and you hear very, very similar things. It's still with us, this type of thinking. Okay, I'm going to take another break, a 5-minute break. I'll see you in another 5 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
I found someone left some messages on the chat box. I just discovered one question that was left by Lu Song at 10:22 my time. So that would be 3:22. So the question is, or the claim, the argument is, belief plays an important role for the constitution of knowledge. It is that then enough condition, sufficient condition, but it is not, no, that's, I lost the message. It is the necessary condition, but is not the sufficient condition for knowledge. So belief is the necessary condition, but not the sufficient condition for knowledge. Is that true? And that's absolutely right. So what you write in the chat box is absolutely right. At least this would be the position of Lazetsky, that it's a necessary condition, belief. You have to believe something in order to know it, but belief alone is necessary but not sufficient for knowledge. That knowledge, you need something else. What you need is the belief to be true. It has to be true. So you have to add truth. And then you still need something else, because a true belief is still not sufficient. It's necessary, but it's still not sufficient for knowledge. That's the traditional teaching. We'll see next week what the complete traditional theory is next week. But what you have here is right, is correct. Good. So let's go back and finish this analysis of Aristotle. We have I have to finish on time this morning or this afternoon because I am still getting ready to leave and pack. So we'll finish about 10 minutes to 5, about 10 minutes before 5. Okay, so here's the key point is that Aristotle relies on by nature. And that's very, very difficult to even conceive of nature. How can people, masters and slaves and women have different natures, right? Since we're all the same species, we're all the same, we're all rational animals. According to Aristotle, we're rational animals. So how can he then say, by nature, we are so different that the slaves don't have power over their bodies. They depend on the power of the master, and they don't have power over their own thinking. They have to depend on the master's thinking, and base all of this on biology, on physis. Physis is let me write this here. Nature is in Greek is physis. Right, this is the Greek word, physis, and we get, in English, we get physics, the science of physics, from that, physiology, physis. But no, physics just means nature, whatever comes into being from nature. That's physics. Okay, so that's the point. So number 2 here, the master is governed for the good and the benefit of the whole, and the slaves are governed and directed by the rational powers of the masters. And so since the powers of the masters are aiming for the good of the whole, the benefit of the whole, the slaves also benefit from the benefit in the good of the whole, because they're part of the whole, even though they're part of the whole by belonging to the master's body and the master's mind. And this naturally beneficial arrangement is not only beneficial to the whole political community, which is called the polis in Greek. The political community is the polis. It is also morally just, that it is morally good, according to Aristotle. It's certainly good for the political community, who for the men who live in the polis. It's very good for them. But how is it morally just for everyone? This makes no sense. This is added on by Aristotle based on a fiction. It's made up, that doesn't exist. And so he's trying to justify the physical difference, which doesn't even exist, but he's trying to base it, the difference, and call it moral, call it physical distinction, a moral distinction, morally good distinction. And this makes no sense at all. It makes no sense. Number 3, the slave is part of the master, a working, functioning part, but a part that lacks rational agency or autonomy of its own. So this is a key term. It's not this term autonomy is a very important word, but it's not Aristotle's word because it's invented in the modern world. It's a very important term for Kant in the 18th century. Autonomy really means you're your own master. You're your own agent. That thinking and willing makes you the master of yourself. So autonomy is you make the rule. You will what to do and what to think. You are the center of authority for yourself. That's autonomy. This is defended and justified philosophically by Kant in the 18th century, starting in 1785 and all through the 1790s. Kant defended the autonomy. But this is really what we mean by rational agency. And so Aristotle has to say that the slave lacks autonomy, the slave lacks rational agency, and depends on the master for that. Now, continue. This is still the politics. If you want to find it, you find the paragraph numbers here, 1255b to 10. If you have the text of the politics, it'll be in the paragraph number 1255b to 10. Hence, there is a certain community of interest in friendship between slave and master in cases when they have been qualified by nature for those positions. Although when they do not hold them in that way, but by law and by constraint of force, the opposite is the case. So again, this is basing the argument, the division on nature, qualified by nature. The division is qualified by nature, which is a fiction, according to me and other people. It's made up. But when it's not qualified by nature, if it's done by law or by force, then it's not justified. So we're saying, if you force someone in to become a slave, or if you pass a law that makes someone a slave, if it's not based on nature, then it's not just, okay? But he still has no grounds for saying it's based on nature. And still, the argument is still unjustified if it's based on something that doesn't justify division of body and mind, that the master has the power of body and the power of mind, and the slave does not. Aristotle asserts that this arrangement is natural and beneficial for all, except when A, the masters are immoral, or B, the slaves are not slaves by nature. For instance, they are prisoners of war. So if the slaves are not slaves by nature, if they're prisoners of war, then it might be unnatural and therefore immoral to make them slaves. On slaves and women, now continue reading. This is still book 1 of the Politics. I'll read the whole thing. On the other hand, since the slaves are men and share in the rational principle, it seems absurd to say that they have no virtue. A similar question may be raised about women and children, whether they too have virtues. Ought a woman to be temperate and brave and just? And is a child to be called temperate and intemperate or not? So up right here, Aristotle is honest enough to see the problems in the argument that he's made already for slaves by nature, because slaves are men who share in a rational principle. They're rational. It seems absurd to say they have no virtue. If they have reason, then they must have virtue, right? And the same goes for women and children. If they're rational creatures, animals, then they must have the capacity for virtue, because reason is an excellence that seeks its own completion. It wants to be complete in the terms of the being that it is. So he sees the problem. Aristotle sees the problem. So in general, we may ask about the natural ruler and the natural subject, whether they have the same or different virtues. For if a noble nature is equally required in both, why should one of them always rule and the other always be ruled? So this is a real good argument against Aristotle that Aristotle raises. This should have ended the distinction. He should have put an end to the natural distinction of slave and master and male and woman right there with this sentence that's underlined. If people are virtuous and rational, then there's no natural distinction. Then they have the ability to think and to reason and to act themselves. I'll continue reading. Nor can we say that this is a question of degree, for the difference between ruler and subject is a difference of kind, which the difference of more or less never is. This is difficult to understand here. It's not a question of degree as the difference between ruler and subject. It's a difference of kind. They're two different kinds of being, you're saying. It's not that one has more of the same thing. There's just two different types of things. And again, this is a biological distinction that he wants to insist on. Not that everyone's equal, they're all rational and they have different degrees of difference, but that there are different kinds of things. Aristotle is honest enough to see a problem with this classification. How can slaves, being of the same species as the masters, lack sufficient rationality to govern themselves and to choose their own ends? So that's the question. And of course, the answer is they can't. If they are rational, then they do have the means to govern themselves. They do have sufficient rationality to govern themselves and choose their own ends. A similar incoherence surrounds the case of women, who are also human beings, rational animals. When Aristotle uses the technical term virtue, aristē, he means a natural capacity of a member of a species, like language learning. So virtue is something shared by a species. If you have the capacity of language, then you're a member of the species. If you're a member of the species of rational animal, then you all have the capacity of language. So slaves have the capacity of language, masters have the capacity of language, males have the capacity of language, and females have the capacity of language. So that alone is the argument that Aristotle should be using, the capacity of language that proves rationality. I think Aristotle would say, although we all have the capacity to learn a language, some people learn a language faster and better than others. But this seems very, very arbitrary, because there are many men and masters who don't learn language as well as slaves and as well as women. There are many women who speak and learn languages faster and better than men, and many slaves who speak and learn language better than males, free males or masters. So it's totally arbitrary. It's totally made up. It's not a defensible argument at all by Aristotle. So it's really difficult to read this because he's bending over backwards to justify something that he can't possibly justify. Slaves and women too. Now, quoting, now it is obvious that the same principle applies generally, and therefore almost all things rule and are ruled according to nature. Again, the nature argument, right? The nature. But the kind of rule differs. The freeman rules over the slave after another manner from that in which the male rules over the female, or the man over the child. So they're all different relationships here. Although the parts of the soul are present in all of them, they are present in different degrees. So again, I don't see how he can defend this. You can defend it in terms of children. So he uses this, he sneaks child into this, because that seems to be an obvious case where the child doesn't yet have the full rational degree or the degree of a capacity of reason. The child still has to grow and develop rationality, but the child already has the capacity for language, and that capacity is the capacity then to grow in thinking and reasoning and mathematics and in biology and all the other things that a rational person would have. So he's trying to make us think of the slave and the women in the same way. They have different degrees of rationality, but that the way the child does, but that doesn't make any sense because the child has different degrees only because only to overcome that and develop the reason that any child would develop the reason. There's no difference in seeing a female child from a male child in their language ability and their ability to reason. There's no difference. There's no biological difference. That's absurd. For the slave has no deliberative faculty at all. So then he makes a statement here in bold print. For the slave has no deliberative faculty at all. The slave has no capacity to deliberate about ends, to choose what he wants to do, what is good to do, which is really saying he has no autonomy, he has no agency, he has no deliberative faculty at all. The woman has deliberative faculty, but it is without authority. And the child has, but it is immature. So now we have 3 degrees of deliberative faculty. The slave has no deliberative faculty. That means has no will, no capacity to choose. The woman does, but has no authority. And the child has, but is immature. Okay, I think the child is right. The child has the capacity, but is yet immature. To say that the slave has no deliberative faculty is just a fiction. It's totally a fiction. And the woman has it. So the woman has deliberative faculty, but she lacks authority. So it must necessarily be supposed to be with the moral virtues also. All should partake of them, but only in such a manner, in degree, as is required by each for the fulfillment of his duty. Moral virtue belongs to all of them, but the temperance of a man and of a woman, or the courage and justice of a man and of a woman, are not, as Socrates maintained, the same. The courage of a man is shown in commanding, of a woman in obeying. I'm not sure where he gets that from Socrates, that distinction, the very sexist distinction in Socrates, but it certainly doesn't come from Plato. Where does this distinction come of degrees of having the virtues, but different ways of having virtue? So that there are different degrees, so that the woman can have courage, a woman can have temperance, but she has it in different ways than a man, etc. So the courage of a man is shown in commanding, the courage of a woman in obeying. Again, denying her any deliberative faculty at all. What he's denying is not that women have deliberative faculty, but that they have authority. They don't have authority because they're denied authority, and that's what we can call epistemic injustice, denying a human being the authority to speak his mind, to have the authority to think and to act according to his or her own thinking, his or her own reasoning. That's an injustice to deny that. And this is what Aristotle is doing here without any really sound argument, without any sound argument at all. Aristotle's arguments, so here we talk about epistemic injustice. Aristotle's arguments are intended to save face, to avoid embarrassment, but they are obviously weak, arbitrary, and full of contradictions. Why is he disagreeing with Socrates? Why is he disagreeing with Plato? We should ask, why did the great philosopher fall victim to self-contradiction? Obviously, he was being influenced by unconscious prejudice about the nature, say, biological nature of slaves and the nature of women. He was, in other words, committing epistemic injustice against slaves and women, both of whom are members of the species rational animal, which we should translate as rational agents, where rational means authority of one's own voice and capacity to think. So Aristotle must know this. What does it mean to be rational? It must mean you possess the authority of one's own voice. You have a voice, you have a rational capacity to think and to speak and to deliberate, right? And somehow he's denied women and slaves this capacity, right? He denies women the authority to speak her mind and to think and to act in a deliberative way, only to obey what the male says. So again, this is a cultural prejudice. Perhaps it's unconscious in Aristotle. I wrote unconscious to be kind. Maybe it wasn't unconscious, but it's certainly part of the political and social structure of the polis, of the city, of the political order of Athens, of Greece at the time. So let me just stop here. I want to say something about Miranda Fricka, is a professor at the University of London. Let me pause for a moment to see if anyone has a question. Is that okay? Any questions? No?
No, Father.
Okay, thank you. So let me continue. We have a few more minutes left. So this is a very famous, well known now, Miranda Fricker. Her book, which came out in 2007, is Epistemic Injustice, Power and the Ethics of Knowing. So she claims, her argument is, and I think it's a very good argument, that epistemology can include injustice. We can inflict injustice on people in how we treat them as knowers. If you treat another person as not having authority, as not having his or her own voice, you treat them like a slave, or you treat them like someone who doesn't have the power to think and the power of acting, of commanding her own actions, then you're committing injustice. And she calls it epistemic injustice. So epistemic comes from knowledge, right? It's the Greek word episteme for knowledge. It's an injustice of how we treat people as knowers. We don't treat them as complete knowers. We deny them some authority to speak, and the authority to act. And it doesn't take a lot of imagination these days when the Pope Francis has just landed, he's now active in Lisbon for the youth certain events of the youth, young Catholics from all over the world, males and females. They all have the same voice. They all have equality. And the Pope has gone out of his way to include women on the synod that will take place at the next year, and to give them a vote along with the bishops in this assembly. So I think the Pope has gone to really out of his way not to commit epistemic injustice. Has he done enough? I don't think so, but he's certainly gone to, no one has gone further in terms of the papacy as Pope Francis in a lot sharing and recognizing the injustice of denying people of voice in the church, denying people the right of self-determination, of agency, and of knowing in the church. And it's almost as if he's read Miranda Fricker's book, because those are all the points that she's making. Really, injustice begins with knowing. When you treat a child or a slave or another human being as a slave, or you deny the authority of a woman, you're already committing injustice. You're already injustice is not simply in terms of goods that you deny them. You're denying them a voice. You're denying them rationality. You're denying them reasoning. So justice and injustice are ethical terms. So what meaning do they have in epistemology? So that's what Fricker does. She's defining epistemology in terms of, or applying ethical terms to epistemology, which has never been done before. Although that was started by Zabzetsky before Fricker. But Zabzetsky doesn't apply it to the women's issue, but Fricker does. But it was really Zabzewski that opened up epistemology to virtuous thinking, to evaluation or ethical evaluation of epistemology. They must have an ethical meaning where justice or injustice will take place, not in terms of distribution of wealth or waging war, but in terms of knowing and knowledge. Who has a voice? Who has rational authority? So those are the key issues of knowledge. Who has a voice? Who is permitted to speak? Who is permitted to speak, and who must remain silent? Who has rational authority to make up her mind or his mind, to act, right? All of those things are fundamental to justice. Epistemic, quoting Fricker, epistemic injustice is a wrong done to someone specifically in their capacity as a knower. So we can do wrong, we can be unjust to people as knowers, I think this is really a very, very important insight by Fricker. So two types of injustice. Type 1, testimonial injustice, occurs when prejudice causes a hearer to withhold credibility from a speaker. So you commit testimonial injustice when you don't believe a speaker. And this would be the case in many parts of the world, and certainly in the Bible, that women have less authority, less credibility to their testimony, had less credibility than a male's credibility, than a male's testimony. So a male's testimony had more credibility than a woman's testimony. You see this in the Bible constantly. In type 2, hermeneutical injustice occurs when a speaker is deprived of the necessary interpretive resources needed to make sense out of his or her own social experience. I have to explain type 2, because type 2 is a little bit obscure. And let me explain an example of one, which is easier to understand. Testimonial injustice, number 1, diminishes the capacity of the speaker to convey knowledge to others. The police or authorities don't believe the speaker because of his or her race or her gender. So because of race or because of being a woman, these people have less authority to speak and to give testimony. You see that even when the report of Jesus' resurrection comes from a woman, it comes from Mary Magdalene, that has less credibility than if it comes from Peter, say, in the early church. The early church would say, oh, Peter saw Jesus, or Peter encountered the empty tomb, and not that Magdalene, Mary Magdalene, spoke to him in the garden. That had more power, more authority, etc. And 2, example of 2, in terms of hermeneutical injustice. A woman suffers sexual harassment in a culture that lacks the concepts to interpret and understand what sexual harassment is. So this is a subtle claim, number 2, is in a culture that has not yet recognized sexual harassment as an injustice, and in many parts of the world where this hasn't happened, then the woman lacks the concept of sexual harassment to understand her own experience, right? That this is foreign to them, that I am being exploited, that I am being treated unjustly, because they have never been given the opportunity to look at sexual harassment or other types of sexual abuse as injustice. So this is where the person doesn't even have the concept that would make sense of what she is experiencing. So this is to expose this is a great liberation to people, to allow them, especially women, to allow them to see where the injustice is taking place. And I'm going to, okay, epistemic trust. Two central aspects: the ability of a speaker to convey to others knowledge by telling them, and the inability of a person to make sense of his or her own social situation or experience. This also happens not only in terms of women, but in terms of children who are sexually abused, that they don't even have the concept of sexual abuse by an adult. That's a tremendous injustice to the child, because the child doesn't have the capacity rationally yet, rational capacity to recognize abuse as abuse. And many women would not have yet the capacity to recognize harassment or abuse as abuse. They don't have the concept. They don't have the words. They don't have the language. How does this happen? Social relations are governed by relations of power upon which epistemic trust, I believe, I trust the speaker, depends. So there's epistemic trust is needed. So in Aristotle's worldview, free male citizens of the polis, so free male citizens, will have more credibility in speech than a woman, a slave, or a child. We can see immediately the social and political advantages and the disadvantages of power embedded in the social world. It determines not only if one is believed about his or her own experience, but also if a person can even understand or interpret his own experience of the world. When you deprive a person of the concept, right, then you deprive the person of the ability to understand his or her experience of the world or in the world. Others do not listen to me, and I don't even understand my place in the world. This is a quote from Fricka. Okay, let me, I think I'm going to stop here with the inductionism. I'll come back to this next week because it's almost time to stop, and I have to finish packing before I leave. So that'll be enough for today. And so we'll continue next week with, I'm going to ultimately do the Meno. So we'll be doing Plato's dialogue, the Meno, and then developing on the basis of the Meno of Plato a definition, the complete traditional definition of what knowledge is. And that will lead to then the objection to the traditional understanding of knowledge by, in the 1963 paper of what knowledge is knowledge true belief? That will concern us for a couple of classes, and we'll go thoroughly through that, the critique of the traditional definition of knowledge. So the next class, Monday, will be no class tomorrow, Friday, but Monday will be a class on Meno, Plato, this is the Meno, and then Tuesday will be a class on Gettier, the Gettier problem, on the critique of Gettier of the traditional understanding of knowledge, and that opens up the door to all the confusion in contemporary epistemology on what counts as knowledge. Okay, thank you very much. I'll see you all on Monday in person, Monday morning in Ho Chi in St. Joseph's at some classroom. Thank you very much. Bye. Have a good weekend.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Father.
Bye.
Thank you, Father. Have a flight.
Bye.
Have a good
Bye.
trip.
Bye.